Hello, and welcome to the session regarding the launch of the Material Insights platform. My name is Kenneth Anderson. I'm the Senior Director of Information Technology with the Responsible Minerals Initiative. I'll tell you just a little bit about us and our involvement in this and participation in the development of this. And then I'll turn it over to David Sturms to facilitate the conversation. If you could go to the next slide, David. The RMI was founded in 2008, and since then we've grown to over 400 member companies with over 12 industries represented in our membership. Our mission is to provide tools and resources to help companies make important sourcing decisions and improve their regulatory compliance and responsible sourcing initiatives from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Next slide, please. There's many resources that we provide, including the Reasonable Country of Origin Report, the Conflict Minerals Reporting Template, which is an industry standard for collecting information about smelters and refiners in your supply chain. We have an online smelter database that is publicly available, as well as a special members section with all the full details that includes over 3,000 records of global smelters and refiners. We have the risk readiness assessment, which helps smelters and refiners perform a self-assessment of their due diligence efforts and can be shared with member companies. And we provide a number of due diligence guidance and training programs, which are very well respected and used globally. Our flagship program is the Responsible Minerals Assessment Program. This is a third-party on-site assessment that is very well respected and provides companies an opportunity to access the data and help with their due diligence efforts in responsible mining. If you go to the next slide, David. You can see here the uptake of our programs since our inception, and most notably in the last few years, you can see that this has expanded to include cobalt. We were originally founded, the RMAP program was originally founded in the 3 TGs and has been very successful for many years, and we continue to expand that to cobalt recently and looking into mica and other minerals going forward. Next slide. And as we grow our organization and scope of within the industry, we start looking at what is it that companies in the industry needs in order to move forward. And number one thing we're looking at is data, right? And which data can be used to help support that, and how can we collaborate with our partners in order to provide access to more data. And that leads us directly into what we're looking at here with the Material Insights platform. If you can go to the next slide. We've been working with the OECD and Drive Sustainability going back to 2018 on a project known as Material Change Report, which was very well received and provided insights into a number of materials and the sourcing risk associated with those since 2018. And now we're excited to announce this is moving to an online platform in 2021. If you can go to the next slide. This is really the what today's session is about, to talk about the benefits and for this. And you can see here the schedule that we have in place over the next several months. And RMI, as the sponsor of this program, is very proud to be part of this new platform, and happy to talk about it today in this session. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Stearns from TDI Sustainability, and he's going to lead the discussion going forward. David, we can't hear you.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Very good.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Kenneth, and thanks for letting me know that my camera was turned off. It's my pleasure to have all of you on the call today. It might not be your first OECD side session. If it is, good morning, probably. But excited to have you on board and excited to talk to you about the launch of the Material Insights platform coming up this year as a cooperation between the RMI and the TDI Sustainability as the executing party here doing this. We are joined by a number of panelists from Intel, the London Metal Exchange, OECD, and Fairphone, as well as a colleague of mine from TDI Sustainability. And we will take turns in reflecting on various aspects of the platform, but also just reflecting on the need for data in general and how this will how that impacts our day-to-day business. If you have any questions, I'd encourage you to take advantage of the Q&A function here in the webinar tool, where your questions can be publicly posted, and we'll see if we can answer them online in writing or answer them at the end of the session during the Q&A. If you use the chat box, if there is one, that's also fine, but I will focus on the Q&A for moderating the questions itself. Should we not be able to answer your questions during the Q&A, I'll do my best to get back to you in writing after the session. So please feel free, even if it's towards the end of the session, please feel free to put in your question. And at the very end, you'll see my email address. So if you have follow-up questions, you can also still reach out to us then. But connecting to what Kenneth just said, the Material Insights platform will be a continuation or an overhaul of the Material Change report that many of you might have read before. Material Change featured 18 in-depth profiles, taking a look primarily at OECD risks in those supply chains at the point of extraction, and provided a global overview of about 40 materials with a high-level scoping of the other 22 materials included in that overview. And the threshold here was the risk that were featured in academic literature and that we were able to triangulate would be taken into account with a methodology that was explained in depth at the end of the Material Change report. We got a really positive response from companies downloading this and then using this, with really a few dozen companies having used it to refine their material sourcing strategies, looking at what kind of risks they might have in their supply chains, especially at the point of extraction. It has been designed to help companies prioritize, because until then there was no one resource that tried to provide a comprehensive comparative overview of different materials. And so within the confines of a PDF report, we tried to do so, and I think it was a really positive and successful first product or first resource for companies to use, but it comes with limitations if you have a PDF report. For that reason, we put our heads together with RMI and we thought about how can we relaunch this or update this. And the conclusion was that in the future, this should be something that is regularly updated and hosted on a interactive platform. And we don't want to stop just at due diligence, but really see how we can use this platform online environment to help inform responsible sourcing action after. So how can we drive collective action and more impactful sourcing throughout the supply chain? And here also an important caveat, not only focused on extraction, but at risks at every stage of transformation, from refining and from smelting to refining to material production in various industries. Similar to the initial report, we are not just going to look at 3TG, which for many is a compliance threshold to look at, but we'll take an industry-wide approach looking at metals and materials more broadly, including leather or glass, that would apply to the automotive and electronics industry in terms of where they find their application. And we will extend this in terms of risks, not only to the scope of the Annex 2 risks of the OECD, but also taking a more comprehensive look at that. And my colleague Graham is going to reflect on that in a second as well. In addition to the risk and allegations that would be featured, we are keen to also show the positives of these materials, because the material change report had a very one-sided perspective on materials, only looking at risks. And so the profiles that will be hosted on the platform will also feature what are the main applications of these materials, and as such allow companies that are at the very beginning of figuring out what materials they might have in their supply chain to figure out what's inside their components. Beyond that, we see a great importance in voluntary standards as a tool to navigate responsible sourcing. And so understanding the certifications your suppliers might already have in place is important. And we leverage here a database of more than 50 voluntary standards that are of relevance to the metals sector. And then lastly, not stopping just around compliance. As I said, this is about collective action. So the platform will feature an overview of initiatives that exist that companies such as your own could be supporting at various stages in the supply chain. So it's a rethink of the report as such, with a broadened scope and really a focus on how can this lead to actionable intelligence and insights and action throughout the supply chain. My colleague Graham is going to talk you through some of the main features of the platform, and after that we have the follow-up presentations.
Thanks very much, David, and hello everyone. So I'm going to talk through some of the main features of the Material Insights platform, the design of the platform, the data that's going to be underlying it, and the functionality in terms of what users, companies in the supply chain can hope to get from it. So the design of the Material Insights platform is going to be very much focused on the OECD approach to due diligence, and in particular, step 2 of the OECD 5-step process, which calls for companies to map the risks in their supply chain and then to move on to taking appropriate action to mitigate and engage with those risks upstream. The methodology is being developed at the moment. It's in the final stages, and it's going to, a large part of the methodology is going to depend on a sizable database of allegation reports, public issue reports, published worldwide across the spectrum of environmental, social, and governance issues, and across a very wide range of materials. We're looking at focusing on around 20 materials initially in the next few months, and then growing that list of materials up to 40, perhaps a little higher, over the subsequent months. So it's going to be quite comprehensive in scope and quite sizable as well. We're looking at a database of about several thousand reports, let's say, of various different issues in mineral supply chains to do with the environmental, social, and governance aspects. We have a search technology at TDI called TDI Search 360, which allows us to search the web for quite a high volume of results, gather quite a large amount of data, and then in an automated fashion, and then pass that over to an analyst who will by hand go through all of those results and grade them. So we also, as well as having an automated search methodology, we also have a fairly multifaceted grading and analysis methodology, which looks at things like the severity of the issues that are being alleged, the type of media source that they're being alleged or reported in, whether it be a blog or a local media post or something much more far-reaching, such as a UN report, a legal court filing, something which which has a greater assurance in terms of level of fact checking in order to allow the analysis to reflect that credibility of reporting aspect. And for each issue that we identify, we're also looking at the number of reports that talk about that one issue to see how widespread it has become. And that all feeds into a grading methodology that allows us to compare materials, compare ESG issues between materials, so that users of the platform can see, in a similar way to the materials matrix in material change, which many of you are familiar with. It'll allow users to see that certain issues for certain materials are relatively more or less severe, prevalent, worthy of attention within a supply chain due diligence program than are others. So we've got a few slides here to show some of the early visuals of how it will look. As David mentioned just now, one of the key elements of material insights as an evolution of material change is its interactivity. Rather than just a flat PDF, users are going to be able to interact with the analytics and really tailor it to their supply chain due diligence approach to get what they need out of it. So looking at this slide here, there's in the top right an impression of what the front splash page is going to look like, and then a subdivision of categories in the bottom left, so that users can look at risks by country, say sustainability initiatives, at the actual risk reporting itself, or at voluntary standards mapping. And in the very center, material and risk profiles, which is what we can see in this slide here. So for each material that we feature, we'll have a full profile with some analytics, which are common between material profiles to allow for comparison. And you can see some of the thematic areas that we're planning on including here, the largest industries, largest uses for each material. And then in the sort of lower center, a little snapshot of what a materials matrix could look like, with supply chain stages on the vertical and various different ESG issues on the horizontal, and a heat map color coding of which issues are most severe according to public reporting for which minerals, for which supply chain stages, and for which issue areas. Below that, analytics on the countries, production countries, and country index-based data on some of the ESG issues that are at risk of being associated with material supply chains in those countries due to the prevailing governance environment. On the right-hand side, you can see that we'll also feature information on associations, working groups, ways for companies to get involved in governance with the featured material. And this again keys into the OECD approach, where you move to step 3 and actually looking at how to mitigate risks, often by collective action and by joining or engaging with those associations, those initiatives, in order to effect positive change on the ground. Let's go to the next slide. There's a fuller materials matrix, materials heat map on the right-hand side, where you can see a long list of materials and ESG issues on the horizontal, broken down by social, environmental, governance issues, and to an extent, though we haven't developed the full functionality yet, but to an extent, this information is going to be interactive, and it will be possible to filter in various ways, by mineral, by supply chain stage, and it will be possible to hover, as you can see in the screenshot here, to find out a little bit more information on what's underlying those gradings. On the left-hand side, these are lifted from our previous report, Material Change, and show a breakdown of components inside a vehicle. So for people who are a bit further down the supply chain at the actual manufacturing stage, and they might know what components or products they have in their supply chains, but might not know the actual minerals within them, there'll be resources to help there as well by mapping in between components and products on the one hand, and those materials that are going into it on the other hand. Next slide. And that brings me to the end of the presentation.
Very
So I will pass straight over to Georgina. Bye, David.
Allow me to quickly introduce Georgina. Thanks, Georgina. Georgina Hellett is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the London Metal Exchange, and the LME has been fairly bold or progressive in introducing the OECD guidance and the management framework behind that, not only for 3TG, but for an extended scope of materials. And yeah, Georgina wanted to share a couple of further reflections on how a platform like this could help companies trading on the LME or sourcing through the LME actually conduct their due diligence.
Yes, thank you very much, David, and great to be here today to lend the LME support to such a fantastic initiative, so thank you. And yes, I think it's fair to say that we do think that this is very aligned with the work that the LME is trying to do. As I suspect many of the people on this webinar will know, the LME in 2019 introduced a set of responsible sourcing rules for all of its listed brands. So those are brands that can be used in settlement of contracts traded on the LME. And we start seeing the reporting for that next year in 2022. But I think the link here is the sort of principles which underlie our responsible sourcing rules. So there were 4 of those that we sort of worked out with a foundation of what we were trying to do. So there's no discrimination between ASM and large scale mining. We wanted a pragmatic and clear process. We wanted a good balance between transparency and standards, and we wanted to leverage existing work in the sector, so not add to the sort of proliferation of standards, etc., that are already there. And I think it's those final 2 that are really pertinent to the discussion we're having today and to the work that TDI and RMI are doing. So if I just briefly mention both of those, so transparency and standards. We did an extensive market engagement program when we were writing our rules. We wanted to make sure we got them right. I think we did 3 or 4 formal pieces of engagement. And what we heard time and time again was the importance of transparency. So standards, I think, have huge value as a standalone item. They create a minimum baseline that mean that all producers are getting to the same level. For us at the LME, that's exceptionally important because we have to price, so we need all of the producers to be at that same level as a minimum. But the message that came through very clearly was that the value that standards can have when paired with transparency increases exponentially. So the transparency helps ensure a fair and consistent interpretation, that all producers are doing things the same way. And that in turn helps prevent the risk of greenwashing. And you can also see progress over years. If you're seeing that transparency repeated again and again, it's easy for market participants to see how a particular producer has improved its standards over the years. So I think that is why what RMI and TDI are doing is so important. And indeed, it's very consistent with us at the LME. We're also launching a platform called LME Passport, which started as a sort of centralized repository for electronic certificates of analysis, but will also be available for producers to add ESG related information, sustainability metrics, and so on, which will be a centralized electronic register for all of that information. For both these platforms, what they'll mean for market users is not having to trawl through a whole series of separate CSR reports produced by individual producers. It'll all be available in one place, which will, if nothing else, save time, which is a very valuable commodity at this point. And then just on the second piece, so leveraging existing work in this sector, this maybe seems like a slightly weird fit, but I think it goes to the debate that we're hearing a lot at the moment about the balance between collaboration and competition. So clearly a platform like this is about collaboration. As I said earlier, at the moment, ESG information remains quite siloed. If you want to know what a producer's doing, you've got to dig out their CSR report. Chances are, if they're doing a good job, it's 90 to 120 pages, and you've got to go and search for the piece of information you're after. And if you want to compare that with a different producer, same process again, and so on and so on. This method of centralized data cuts out a lot of that. You can look at work that's already been done by others. You can leverage people who are using similar supply chains. You can look at risks. You can learn. There's a huge educational and informational aspect to that. And I think there is real value in that. So, you know, I think that competition remains hugely important. That is also another huge reason why we make progress. But that balance with collaboration, with initiatives such as this one, really materially moves forward the conversation, and indeed the practical application of some of the rules and standards that are out there, including those by the LME. So I guess it's a big thank you from us at the LME to TDI and RMI for this work. I genuinely think it has the power to move things forward, and delighted to be able to support it today. So thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Rashad. And apologies, Rashad, you were supposed to speak right after Graham, but I hope this is fine. Rashad works for the OECD and is probably known by everybody. So without further introduction.
Thanks, David. And no, it's absolutely fine. I'm going to echo actually a lot of what Georgina said. So it's great that my points can be reinforced. So don't worry about it. So first of all, actually, let me start like Georgina with the bigger kind of policy and regulatory picture about why tools like this are important from the OECD standpoint, and also how it relates to other work the OECD is doing. The expectation, I mean, you don't need me to remind you of this, but the expectation from governments and international organizations is that companies address all negative impacts that they might be causing or linked to in all of their mineral supply chains using a risk-based approach. So this means that companies are expected to go beyond 3TG and beyond Central Africa when they do their due diligence, even though the legislation at the moment is only focusing on just 3TG, and in the US, 3TG in Central Africa. This expectation is only increasing. The EU Responsible Minerals Regulation and the Dodd-Frank Act are only a part of the picture. Similar legislation is forthcoming in Switzerland, and 2 proposed EU regulations on mandatory due diligence are coming up, one for all sectors and one for battery minerals specifically. So those 2 are on the horizon as well. Governments have also introduced a number of ancillary supply chain laws, like the Modern Slavery Acts in the UK and Australia, and a child labor law that's forthcoming in the Netherlands. So all of those require some form of risk-based due diligence, supply chain due diligence as well. On top of this, as Georgina discussed, we have self-regulatory bodies like the London Metals Exchange, as well as other international exchanges introducing due diligence requirements for metals traded on their exchanges. And you also have a number of other mineral-specific responsible sourcing initiatives that, if you're attending one of the many sessions going on this week, you'll hear about, for example, in copper, mica, coal, aluminum, cobalt, etc. So all of this to say that tools are going to be necessary to support companies in broadening their due diligence process, or to help them kick it off if they haven't already done so. Information on risks that exist in mineral supply chains are already out there and can be found through desk research of publicly available information. The difficulty for many companies is knowing where to start and how to make sense of the information that's already out there, and how to use that information to prioritize issues so that they can take an informed risk-based approach. It's here that tools and reports like the Material Change Report from 2018, like this Material Insights platform that we're learning about today, and also like the upcoming OECD paper on trends in stakeholder reporting can be extremely useful. Let me just talk about that paper in a second. So starting in 2019, the OECD initiated a process to gather publicly available information on human rights abuse, financial crime, and conflict finance, the so-called Annex 2 risks, in 40 different mineral supply chains. To do this, we worked with TDI and other stakeholders to design an automated web scraping process using the TDI tool that Graham and David mentioned. And basically meant it to simulate what desk research would look like using keywords linked to those risks and those 40 mineral supply chains. The process generated tens of thousands of search results, which were then filtered down to roughly 1,200 reports dating from January 2017 to December 2019, and in 6 different languages. We then categorized and labeled and counted the reports in order to get an understanding of some of the broader trends in reporting. So basically, what is media, NGO, government, company attention focused on, and what are they talking about in terms of what's publicly available? Our findings in conducting this exercise were pretty interesting. As I said, I'm going to be discussing the paper in a lot more detail on Wednesday afternoon at the OECD session when we launch it. But to give you a preview, one of our main findings was that indeed all 40 mineral supply chains we covered were reported to be associated with some type of risk. Likewise, risks of conflict finance and child labor unsurprisingly extended far beyond the DRC. But unfortunately, DRC receives outsized attention by NGOs and by media, with a high volume of reports either focusing on the DRC or at least mentioning the DRC. This is important, and I'll explain why. This is important because it feeds into the perception that DRC and minerals from the DRC are riskier than other countries to source from, which could then in turn lead to disengagement from mining regions there, rather than continued responsible engagement. It could also mean potentially less due diligence on presumably less risky mineral supply chains because there's less reports about those mineral supply chains. So to combat that perception, this paper points out that other sources of risk information that companies should take into account when conducting a risk assessment. For example, ILO statistics on forced labor that may describe what's going on in terms of the labor risk profile in other countries, even though there's a lack of NGO or media reporting about minerals in those countries specifically. So if that makes sense. So the reason that sources like the Material Insights, like the Material Change Report, like the OECD Trends paper are important is that it provides more contextualized information about risks globally. And so it acts as a very critical input in a company's risk assessment and risk prioritization process. So it's our hope that with this increased information coming from these reports and these tools, that companies will start to engage more responsibly with actors in all of their supply chains, not just this kind of very narrow scope that we've seen mostly in the last 10 years. So this framework for gathering publicly available information, which served as kind of partially the common foundation between all of our 3 reports. Sorry, just getting a little mixed up. This information served as the common foundation for all the 3 reports, and we're really happy to see that RMI and TDI and Material Insights are taking the project actually further than the OECD had the mandate to with our paper. We're really pleased to see that you're able to make comparisons and risk profiles and judgment calls about the reports and about the materials that the OECD is really not in the position to make. We think this could be quite useful for companies who decide to use that tool. And so yeah, for audience members interested in this issue, interested in how companies and different stakeholders, governments and civil society as well, are going beyond the Annex 2 risk scope, beyond 3TG, can also, in addition to participating in conversations like this, join us on Wednesday when we launch the report and we hear other examples of how this is being done in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashad. Very, very valuable reflections. With this and 10 more minutes on the clock, I'd like to hand over to Aaron. Aaron is the Responsible Minerals Program Manager at Intel, also a member of the RMI. And thank you very much for taking the time to making your contribution today to this webinar.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to start by really echoing Rashad and Georgina that we see the momentum moving everywhere really to expand beyond 3TG and beyond cobalt. And specifically, so Intel, about a year ago, Intel released our CSR Rise initiatives. And as part of this program, we've committed to pursue responsible sourcing of all minerals used in semiconductor manufacturing by 2030. We're already beginning this journey of incorporating this next phase into our program. And really, this was selected by conducting an internal risk assessment based on usage, prevalence of sourcing from conflict-affected high-risk areas, as well as other salient risks identified in the original material change report. So, we have this material change report has already been put to a lot of good use by us over the years. And so we're actually very excited about seeing this updated and having it be more interactive. So as our goal states, responsibly sourcing across the periodic table, which you can see here, we've kind of outlined. This is a non-inclusive list of many of the minerals used in semiconductor manufacturing. And in order to really kind of boil down what we need to work on next and to prioritize that, we really need help from experts in the industry. And so, working together as an industry to evaluate risks, document standards that are relevant to all of these minerals, and an interactive tool such as the mineral risk assessment can help enable companies to evaluate their mineral risks holistically so that we can prioritize our focus and align on a collective action to address these risks. So really having this interactive, up-to-date platform containing mineral risk information, it'll allow companies to make swift, informed decisions. And we can then align our efforts and devote our time and resources to really conducting the due diligence, mitigating those risks, and driving towards responsible sourcing of all of the relevant minerals. So that's really my kind of my interest, and from Intel as a whole, we're really quite excited about this interactive tool and how we're going to be able to use it to really drive our program forward and work with the industry to drive things to the next level.
Thanks a lot. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Tirza. She's the Sustainable Minerals and Mining Manager at Fairphone. And even the work with material change predates or leads back to work that TDI has originally done with Fairphone or for Fairphone, helping them to scope out their supply chain. So it's really nice to have you now reflect on what you've done with this initial information and also how a tool such as Material Insights might help other companies do something similar.
Definitely. Thank you, David. And thank you indeed to Sustainability and RMI to host the session and to bring this forward. I think that's a very, very interesting and promising tool as we've just heard. So let me share how we use that so far in Fairphone. Starting for the ones that do not yet know Fairphone, we're on a mission to establish a market for ethical electronics, really motivating the entire industry to act more responsibly. And one of the impact areas in which we aim to do this is fair materials and material sourcing. And when it comes to sourcing and responsible sourcing, we apply these 4 principles, really using our buying power as a catalyst for investment. We've talked a lot about risks, knowing the risks, but also looking at risks, also at opportunities for change, and as we say at Fairphone, for positive impact for people and planet, looking at continuous improvement, reporting also on the progress they made, and not just addressing the risks in our own supply chain, but really working towards systemic change. So with those principles in mind, and knowing that fair material sourcing is one of our impact themes, question of course arises, where do you start? So indeed, as David said, even prior to the material change report, Fairphone in 2017 conducted a first scoping study together with TDI Sustainability, looking at a long list of materials and doing an initial assessment of the risks, social, environmental, governance related risks for each of those. And this ultimately, of course, was brought further and further in scope and also in detail with the material change report. But this initial scoping list led Fairphone to prioritize ultimately, firstly, 8 focus materials. So it helped us from 2017 onwards focus our efforts in material sourcing towards those. And we set the target to sustainably source these materials by 2020. So by the end of last year, we're at the time that we needed to indeed reprioritize and refocus our efforts on material sourcing, and recognize that indeed that also meant a refreshment of or fresh eyes on the data and the information that exists, maybe changing risks and changing, looking at the changing landscape of material sourcing as well. So basically we redid the exercise in a way, looking at our vision of working towards a circular economy on the one hand, but recognizing also the need for responsible mining in order for that transition to be a fair and just one. So we looked at a long list of the materials again, using material change then as an updated report, but also looking at other sources, what initiatives are out there, and what other comparable data can we find, to update the original matrix that we had, that material change had as well, to base our new priorities and strategies on. So how we went about this, and how did we come to our reprioritization, if you may, of materials, initially looking also at opportunities for change. So if you go to the next slide, David, you see that we do not only look at it from a risk perspective, but really, as I said, in light of the sourcing principles that we have at Fairphone, looking at which so-called thought leadership areas where we see industry effort is really needed to drive positive impact as well, both at the recycled supply chains for post-consumer recycling chains, as well as developing fair artisanal small-scale mining solutions, as well as large-scale mining solutions to drive impact. So with this lens, we looked at all the different materials and assessed initially, if you go to the next slide, what the share of the electronics industry was for each of these materials, to assess whether we as an industry, electronics industry, have an opportunity to influence the criticality, and then of course also the social and environmental governance related risks for each of those materials. So basically all we're talking about Material Insights will provide us is what we looked at ourselves initially, really trying to compare those. And I can tell you that's a whole lot of work, and I think the platform itself and the way we're looking at this will be a great opportunity for all of us to, with the individual company prioritization, but well as an industry as a whole, select where we think we have an influence and where the most urgent drive and need for change is. So we took another step into deep diving in our long list to bring that down to a shorter list, also looking at the material demand growth and the outlook for the demand forecast and outlook for the coming years, the depletion rates, and also the mining sector dependency, to really inform also our strategies of where recycling becomes key and critical, and where we should not forget about mining, and do also look at responsible mining as an important sector for further development. So that's the exercise we have just been going through, ultimately resulting in our new Fairphone, let's say, next list of priority materials, which are the 14 materials that you see on the next slide. That is for us the new material roadmap we will be working on until 2023. But I think I just gave you that example in the roadmap we've been going through, because that's exactly what we've been going through as Fairphone, but building on the data that we had in material chains and existing data out there, and having that coming together in Material Insights is of course a great resource for all of us, for us as RMI members and the industry users, to come and collect those important insights to inform strategies. So if you go to the next slides, ultimately, I think that's where we use our data for, and then again, looking at the principles from Fairphone, not only from a perspective of where we address our risks, but also, and great to hear, Material Insights will offer that as well in its platform, looking at solutions. I think there's many materials where existing solutions are there, opportunities scaling those exist as well. So having a platform where per material, some of these initiatives, standards, alliances that bring that opportunity to drive change and to join existing initiatives would be a great resource to have. And at the same time, I'm pretty sure there's many of us that need to come together to also innovate and create new solutions where they do not yet exist. So really excited for the platform to take it to the next step. And thanks, David, for the invitation.
Thank you, Tirza. We've got a minute on the clock to finish, but if there's any questions, now would be the time to bring them up. There is one question that I believe Georgina already touched on, but it's asking specifically to the LME passport, whether you could outline the the differences between the LME passport and Material Insights from your opinion or your understanding of the platform? That's the only question that's been posed so far. Maybe we can still look at that and otherwise close on time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So it's a great question because the LME passport platform is still under development, so there is no definitive answer to that yet. Plus, I have not seen the Material Insights sort of functionality, but they're trying to answer very similar questions, which is what information can we provide that would be helpful for consumers or other market participants in order to help progress the ESG agenda. So we're using aluminium as a pilot, like I say, starting with electronic certificates of analysis, which are the documents that accompany metal in and out of warehouses, which is key for LME delivery. And then on the sustainability side, we're trying to address the sort of most pressing market needs as told to us. So I think within that aluminium scope, we're looking at emissions, we're looking at a methodology for measuring emissions for aluminium, because one of the core problems seems to be that even within the existing methodologies available, such as the GHG protocol, there's a lot of variety in terms of how that's interpreted, and the information that results from that is very difficult to compare. So we're working with the International Aluminium Institute to try and address that. And we will broaden that out to other metals as we move forward. So I guess maybe the short answer to that is I think the LME passport system will be much more focused in the short term. It won't have the same sort of breadth that the TDI RMI platform offers, but hopefully we will get there.
Great. And it also doesn't need to duplicate, so it's nice if there are complementary functionalities or a piece of information across these platforms. As you were responding, we got just yet another question, and allow me to just pick these up and then spend maybe a couple of more minutes on questions if all panelists have time for that. The question here addressed again to LME and TDI, but I think also it would be interesting to hear Aaron and Tirza reflect on this, saying, what sort of additional ESG risks are expected in the next iteration of the material change platform and LME efforts? For example, multiple standards and frameworks place great emphasis on gender equality and related policies. What other issues are on your radar? So maybe if we could start with the companies of saying, from a private sector perspective, what is it that you're currently looking at? And then have Graham and Georgina reflect on if that's also mirrored in our design of the platform.
I could go ahead and start. So I think that, for sure, I think that gender-related issues are certainly of utmost concern. And also just getting more into the environmental issues, especially the egregious ones that would in some ways overlap with human rights issues. So, water, soil contamination, things like that. So I think that, a lot of these ESG issues that maybe haven't been previously captured in, mineral assurance processes and OECD Annex 2 risks, things like that. So I would really say that ESG and gender equality would be a couple of the upcoming issues that from a downstream company we'd be most interested in.
Great. Anything to add to that, Tirza?
Yeah, maybe on top of what's said, which are of course important ones, is what we looked into, and I think is still a gap as well, is from the recycling perspective and the recycling chain, what issues are there, or what if the materials is kind of at this end of life. And I'd be curious to see if that, maybe not initially, but in the future could also become part of such a platform. There's also, of course, a whole lot of ESG related risks in those changes. So that would be, I think, a next step to look into.
Well, Graham, I'd like you to elaborate more in depth, but just to respond to Tirza directly, we are looking already at this stage now at end of life of recycling, or at least scrap materials as part of the supply chain stages, which again, as we said, is a step, a further step away from the material change that only looked at extraction, where we want to say we include everything, including recycling. But Graham, please feel free to add to that, and also the scope of risks that we envision to address or tag across these allegations.
Thanks, David. Yeah. So just to reiterate, we are absolutely looking at recycling and the issues around recycling in that stage of the supply chain. And actually, we're going to look at all stages of the supply chain, and the data that we have is going to be disaggregated by supply chain stage. So we're going to be able to look at the mining stage, the smelting stage for minerals that are smelted, the latter processing stages, and then the circular economy stage where things happen at the end of those minerals' lives, or they get fed back into the loop and come through the recycling chain. So in terms of supply chain stage, we're completely broad spectrum, and also in terms of the ESG issues that we're looking at. What we've done when developing our issue typology for categorizing our data is to look at existing standards and frameworks with the aim of capturing the full range of ESG issues relevant to mineral supply chains and making sure we're not missing anything, and at the same time we're categorizing them into a sort of manageable number of different issues. So we've put quite a bit of work into looking at different typologies and to developing one which we think is a good fit, and we'll cover hopefully all the issues of relevance to downstream users. In addition to the ESG components, we're also going to be looking at issues of supply chain resilience, which is increasingly becoming co-located, in this sort of issue space with ESG issues, when companies are looking at potential future crunches in mineral supply and looking at where in the world they're potentially going to be getting the minerals they need from in the future, and how those supply issues interlink with the ESG issues that they're going to need to be thinking about associated with different regions and areas of supply. So essentially, in all those areas, supply chain stage and ESG and resilience, our aim is to capture the full gamut of different issues and facets of how we're looking at supply chain due diligence.
Thanks, Graham. A last question before maybe Kenneth could close the session or provide a closing remark from RMI's perspective, but touching on something that Rashad also mentioned, there's not always allegation data available, maybe not for specific materials either. So will we rely on allegations solely for our risk scoring, and what will be our threshold for including it?
We are not solely looking at public issue reports at allegations, and I see here the question from an attendee regarding the difficulties of some countries not having a free press, not necessarily having impartial journalism. It's difficult to account for that in a balanced way across the board, but we will at least have some component of that. Because in addition to the issue reports that we're looking at, we're also looking at the country level indices. So, for example, a mineral that's being sourced in a country with a very restricted press might not necessarily get many reports of issues coming up, but then the fact that that country has a very restrictive press would be reflected in the scoring, and so that would, to an extent, sort of balance that issue out. Though, of course, the platform isn't going to be infallible; it's part of a process, and it gives really a first impression of where companies should be looking, how they can start to prioritize their risks, and it's always, within the supply chain due diligence approach, needs to be backed up by a company's own judgment on how they're going to consider risks in their supply chain.
Thanks a lot, Graham. Slightly over time, Kenneth, but I'd appreciate if you provide some closing remarks.
Absolutely, and thanks, David, and thanks all the panelists for their insights and contributions here. I think it's very clear that the Material Insights platform is going to be very timely, and it's very well anticipated. So RMI is very excited to be a sponsor of this, and look forward to working with everyone on getting this launched, and hope for it to be a very successful resource for all our stakeholders. So thanks again to the panelists, and thanks for the attendees, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to
Thank
the
you.
panelists. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Everyone.